Okay, well, thanks a lot, everyone, for coming here today for the next edition of VMACS. I just want to give a quick reminder of the ground rules. So everyone's audio and video is going to be muted. Your audio cannot be turned on at any time, neither by you nor by any of the panelists. There'll be a 60-minute talk followed by a 30-minute interactive Q&A session where you can raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question of the speakers. During that time, we will give you the ability to unmute your microphone, but we will not unmute your mic without your consent. If you have questions during the talk, please use the Q&A feature to ask the question, which will be answered there. And so please reserve the chat feature in case there's technical difficulties or we can't hear the speakers or see the slides, things like that. So without further ado, we are very happy to have Bob Hall here from Hoover Institution and Stanford University. And Marianna Kudlyak from the San Francisco Fed to talk to us about recoveries, which I know we all hope the next one is a speedy one. Bob, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, you were supposed to explain that.
Oh, sorry, yes, you can.
Full screen is not working in Menlo Park right now, in spite of being headquarters of Acrobat. So bear with us. We can almost fill a screen, but we can't do full screen. Okay, well, thanks, Kurt, and everybody for giving us this opportunity. I guess one thing is very fine print here, but it is important with respect to Marianna's participation. Accept the fact that she's not speaking on behalf of the Federal Reserve System, but rather just herself as a researcher. So this is a project we started working on last September when it looked like the current recovery was going forever, because it virtually had. But we're going to stick with basically with the framework that we developed in, which was to try to answer the question in the title. Why is the recovery process so uniform and successful over the past 70 years measured by unemployment? And the question of, at the very end, time permitting, I will say a little bit about what we can see in current unemployment data, which is quite interesting. But it's not, this is not a forward-looking paper in the sense of focusing primarily on what the next recovery is going to look like, but rather a detailed look at the recoveries since the unemployment rate was properly measured starting at the beginning of 1948. Okay, so we're going to talk about unemployment, but we think of unemployment as one of the best ways of tracking the business cycle. Another way, which is popular, is to look at the GDP gap, which we measure as the ratio of GDP to its potential value. We've actually done some work in parallel, but it is quite remarkable how closely the measures of potential GDP result in that ratio of being very similar to unemployment. So we take unemployment seriously. Both of us have taken unemployment seriously throughout our careers. So we think that unemployment really tells us something important about unused resources. And in particular, we believe, as the Romerists have suggested in a recent paper, that the best measure of the business cycle is the unemployment rate. So we observe, and we'll start by showing some data on the fact that recoveries from adverse shocks in the US economy over the past 70 years have been quite remarkably consistent when measured by the decline in the unemployment rate that occurs during the recovery. And I'll explain that slide, the teaser slide that was showing when you came in that respect. But we are aware of the fact that the truths that we uncover in this research are not universal with respect to different time periods in the US economy, and especially not universal with respect to the business cycle in other countries. We're prepared to believe that what we're finding is true and important for the US economy, but not for most continental European countries, for example. And within the US, you don't see the same behavior of the unemployment, if it's to the extent we can measure it, in the 1930s. So we're not advocating this as universal with respect to the earlier US history. We're aware, and this is something that I've studied a little bit, that the US economy managed to absorb about 10 million returning soldiers after World War II in a remarkably small amount of time. They never even became unemployed. It was so fast. And finally, as I mentioned before, the unprecedented spike in unemployment in March and April of this year, and the surprising decline last month in May, are facts that we're tracking carefully, but we'll have a little bit to say at the end about how that fits in. But we're not, since that's not a complete business cycle yet, we're not including that in the cyclical data that we're going to talk about. Okay, so here's the basic facts laid out in, I think, in a useful way. The red bars show the total increase in percentage points that occurred in each of the cyclical recoveries that are in our chronology. We're using an unemployment chronology here, which is very similar to, but not the same as, that four-letter organization in Cambridge, whose name I forget. And others doing similar research have done the same thing, but this picture would look quite similar, but not identical. And I'll show some numbers in a minute if you do take the NBER chronology instead of our chronology. Okay, so while there's big variation in the red bars, that's the total amount of decline in unemployment across business cycles, because the business cycles themselves are very heterogeneous with respect to their severity and therefore the amount of recovery that can occur afterwards. On the other hand, the blue bars, especially as you get into the 1960s and later, is the per year amount. And the per year amount is just under 1 percentage point per year across all the recoveries since the 1960s. And this is pretty amazing, because when you look at other aspects, even if you looked at GDP growth, it wouldn't look like this because of other things that are happening. But this is a real uniformity. And so we think that's important. Okay, so here are the numbers that I mentioned. If you use the NBER chronology of unemployment, the average decline in all the recoveries, all the completed recoveries now. When we started this project, we didn't know what to do with the last recovery, but then fate intervened, and now we know that the last recovery ended in February of this year. Using the NBER chronology, you get just over half a percentage point, standard error of 0.11, so it's that's the standard error of that estimated coefficient. So it's pretty precise. There's a new chronology from Dupratis and Nakamura and Steinson, very interesting paper. It's getting a lot of attention. Very, very much complementary to our paper. It doesn't really overlap that much with this paper. We're not competitors. We're complements. And their chronology, their machine-developed chronology, gives a bigger number because it's closer to looking only at unemployment to develop the chronology. And then Marianna and I have made a chronology which is using this strictly human pattern recognition skills. And we get a number which is almost exactly the same as comes from the machine numbers that DNS come up with. So these these are the numbers we're looking at. Notice how small they are. After all, in a severe recession, the unemployment rate goes up, say, 5 percentage points. And so this says that it's going to take around 6 years to get back to where you were before. And that's a long time. So the duration of this process is what a lot of this research is looking at. And I think we made some progress on that. But still. Okay, so this is another way of displaying, and I think in ways this is the one that's been most persuasive to most audiences. The path of convergence of unemployment during a recovery has two features. One is that it's pretty constant. It's pretty much the same slope. That is just under 1 percentage point per year. Occasional hiccups, but the most recent recovery is the most spectacular. It's the longest and biggest. And the other thing is that these lines are straight. In every model we develop, there's a controlling eigenvalue that tells you what ultimately happens by way of approach to some stochastic equilibrium of the process. But that's absent here. Almost, there's only the hint of curvature. Instead, it's linear. And that, I think, is a completely new finding. So there's actually two things, two moments to match here, so to speak. One is, as I say, the similar slope across all these lines. But the other is the fact that it defies the rules of dynamic systems as we understand them, which is that there's one eigenvalue that controls the process in the longer term. And therefore you get curving approach to the stochastic equilibrium of the model. But that's just not true here. It's just the slightest hint. There's an interesting question which we've never found the
answer. Can I just interrupt you for a second? We're getting some kind of reverberation feedback from your audio. So I don't know if maybe try sitting back a little bit from the computer, but it's kind of is making it a little bit hard for people to hear. Why don't you try speaking like that, just so we can see?
Okay, so that's why I wanted to do it on the phone. You want to take the time to try the phone? Is that?
Yeah, if you want to try to connect the phone, if you think that would give it better audio, why don't we try that?
Okay, hang on.
Or even you could always just add you could connect just the audio from your phone and leave the computer connected and just mute the computer. Yeah. That would be, yeah.
Yeah, but I have to do it through. It has to be propagated to the audience through Zoom.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'm going to have to stop sharing to get access to. Okay, let's see.
We've lost the audio on you now, Bob. Let me see what I can do, if anything, on my end. Apologize to everyone for the technical difficulties. We are Bob, I think maybe if you just were to sit back, kind of like in that position, that there was less reverberation. So why don't we just try kind of, from that position? I think it'll be.
I've searched everywhere. It looks like they suppressed the telephone option for some reason. So that's just not an option.
You sound good now, though. So let's.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So let's.
Okay, is that good?
Yeah, so I think sit back a little bit. Maybe when you started sharing your screen, maybe there's a little reverberation, but when you sit back, it's better. So let's just go forward with that.
That's weird. There's no reason for that. There's no other device on. All right.
Yeah.
Still a few bugs in the system.
Yeah, no, you sound good now. So yeah.
All right. So we need to say this is not a paper about recessions, except that we essentially start the story right after a contraction has occurred, and there's a state variable, a key state variable, namely unemployment rate, which is a very sluggish state variable on the recovery side. It's very rapid moving during the recession. And then we take that as history, and then we track forward. But we need to say something about how we think about recessions. And recessions are contractions in economic activity in which the economy collapses quickly. It's, I think, essentially infallible that if people start saying the economy is in free fall, a recession's occurring. And that was happening in March and April of this year, but it came to a surprising halt in May. So anyway, the authorities ruled that the recession began. The expansion ended in February and the recession began. Spikes in unemployment, as I mentioned before, have heterogeneous magnitudes. And the one that just occurred being the largest, and also quite heterogeneous causes. There's no, unlike the uniform behavior of expansions, the shock that causes recession has a different character seemingly in each one. If you look at the last five that are listed here, and they're completely heterogeneous. The last three was the tech crash in 2001, relatively mild recession, the financial crisis in 2008, which was a deep recession, and the pandemic recession that began in March that has raised unemployment to a previously higher level than ever measured before in the US. We'll come back to talking at the end of some ideas about the character of that. But our objective is to understand this contrast between the uniformity of the rates of recovery of unemployment and the diversity of the sources and magnitudes of recession, contraction, bursts, spikes of unemployment. And then we want to explore models that deliver slow and steady restoration of employment relationships with corresponding decline in unemployment. And that's been known as a challenge. There's a very important, well-known paper by Cole and Rogerson, 1999, that raised this puzzle, the central puzzle being recovery of unemployment occurs at a much slower speed than job finding does for individuals. So there's something about the aggregate relationship that moves very much slower than individual experience does, at least experience in finding a job. So you can think of, if you ask what's the most important paper in the literature that lies behind ours, I think it's no doubt that it's the paper by Cole and Rogerson, which as soon as I saw it in the late 90s, I realized that he was really onto something. Or they were really onto something. And I still have that belief. All right, so we're going to go through a set of steps. One is to quantify the extra job loss that occurs in recession. So this is trying to set the stage for the initial value of that stated variable in our dynamic analysis. And that's, it seems invariably to have a large but short-lived spike. The job loss, which we can measure in a variety of ways, which we explored pretty thoroughly, the job loss is a spike, or the extra spike. And you'll see that there's always, job loss occurs all the time, natural turnover in the economy, but by all job loss measures, there's an extra spike that occurs at the onset of the recession. Then we're going to compare the volume of extra job loss that occurs in the recession, that is the initial value of unemployment, with the amount of unemployment that occurs during the glide path back to full employment. And we're going to talk about what we call the direct channel, which is it simply that the very people who lost jobs go through a long, complicated process, and that's why there's a continuing high level of unemployment that's worked off only slowly, because that reflects the slow character of their experiences. The answer is twofold. One is, yes, we believe it is very true that the exact people who lost jobs go through a long, painful, extended process with typically multiple spells of unemployment, which causes their unemployment path to only decline slowly in spite of finding jobs relatively quickly at each point. But that's not enough, because there just aren't enough of those people. And there's something else that's causing unemployment to remain high. There's some propagation of unemployment beyond the initial victims. And they actually account for the majority. The direct channel can only be a fraction well under half of the total. We can show that. Okay, and then we do a certain amount of work to try to track that down in terms of the actual experiences. This draws in part on an earlier paper of ours. And we float a concept called the effective exit rate from unemployment, which is much lower than the per period, the per quarter transition rate out of unemployment, because people go back into unemployment. So the effective job finding rate is much lower than the instantaneous job finding rate. And then we investigate models of the steady recovery of unemployment that bring in factors such as congestion effects that would cause unemployment to spread into the rest of the labor market beyond the initial victims. Um, and finally, we ask, well, what about other influences? Unemployment presumably, is influenced by factors other than just the inheritance of a bygone recession. And we pretty much suggest that that's not true, that there's relatively little indication of effects of policy variables, for example, macro policy variables, which have very heterogeneous behavior and doesn't seem to disturb unemployment from its 0.85 percentage points per year path. So, our basic conclusion from all this work is that the economy has a powerful tendency to recover from serious adverse shocks, but the recovery takes a lot of time. And this suggests a very different view of the business cycle from the view of the business cycle that has completely taken over, in my opinion, way more than it deserves. But everybody except me, and maybe I convinced Marianna, thinks of the business cycle in terms of the Keynesian model these days. But we see these results as suggesting something quite different, and more falling into the category of the real business cycle type of analysis. So we see the unemployment that is devoted to rebuilding these as basically a subtraction from labor supply. And so the reduction of labor supply and recategorization into unemployment is the major factor in the business cycle, according to this view. Okay, so let's now plunge into the data. Since the JOLTS survey was created starting in 2001, we have very good measures of layoffs. They pretty much tell the same story as layoffs measured in the current population survey, but we rely pretty heavily on, in the years since 2001, on JOLTS. And here's what I was describing before. There's a background level of layoffs, which is pretty high. There's lots of turnover in the U.S. economy, a dynamic economy. Davis and co-authors would explain. And then when a recession comes along, especially a deep one like in 2008, 2009, you see a spike and a jump upward, but it's not persistent. Almost none of the persistence of unemployment arises from persistent driving force as measured by layoffs. So if you're looking for persistence mechanisms, the shock that causes a recession typically, and this is very typical, if you go back, we don't have JOLTS before this, but we have other measures of layoffs, and they look pretty much the same, especially in serious recessions. Okay, so one immediate answer is that, and this will be true in all the measures we look at, the persistence that we're after is not explained by persistent higher flows into unemployment. That's not the right theory of the business cycle. There's in the data a measure called mass layoffs, and you can see that reaches a substantial peak, especially here in 2008, 2009. And it mirrors the behavior of all layoffs. And if you look in the CPS in terms of unemployment, then there is this critical measure, which is critical today, permanent job loss, that is, loss of a permanent job. It's not the loss that's permanent, it's the job that's permanent. And you can see that rises really astronomically from earlier levels. It has more of its dynamics come just from recessionary shocks. And here, like all measures of unemployment, it does have persistence, less persistence than total unemployment, but persistence is there, and that's a hint of the kinds of mechanisms that we're going to be talking about further. Job destruction, the availability of JOLTS has pretty much put job destruction off the stage, but it is, of course, a measure that's available before JOLTS, and we've known since job destruction started to be measured in the 1980s that it has a spike. There's a very interesting survey, and I think an underused survey, which we've been trying to exploit, on the displaced workers survey, which has very large recession spikes. So a displaced worker is a worker who had at least 3 years of tenure, well, that's the basic definition. So someone who suffered a layoff, who was pretty embedded in the work structure, presumably there's a loss of job-specific capital for this type of person, because most turnover in the labor force occurs among very low tenure people. So when you look specifically at displaced workers, you get a very different picture. And again, like all the measures we're looking at, it has a considerable spike over its normal level in recessions. And finally, one thing that's gotten a lot of attention recently is initial applications for unemployment insurance, and that reaches a peak normally. Of course, it reached a tremendous peak and has subsided from that peak in the last few months. Okay, so then if you say, well, numerically what's important? Well, first of all, it's the two measures of layoffs, and the number of people involved is much higher for the layoff measures than for other measures. Okay, so that gives you a picture of that sets the value of this state variable that we want to study. In the wake of the spike of job loss, the character of the labor market has been changed dramatically. There are more workers looking for work who lost what they thought were permanent jobs, and we want to push forward from that day forward. And we've already established that what we're trying to understand is that just under 1% decline in unemployment each year is going to occur until the next shock occurs. All right, so the second step is to ask them, looking as the recession goes on, as the recovery goes on, what's the relationship between the number of initial victims and the cumulative amount of unemployment years during the recovery? We're going to talk about what we call the direct channel, which is the exact people who lost jobs, who go through this complicated, long process of trying to reestablish a permanent job relationship, which goes through typically several trial jobs, short jobs, interim jobs, and so on. So the key question is it the same people, or is there some spreading of extra unemployment, even though among people who were not victims of the initial unemployment burst, but something happened, there was some change in their experiences. And the answer is going to be that there's a lot of such people, because we can count the number of victims, and we can look at unemployment years later, and we can get some ideas, especially from one survey, about how long the direct effect lasts. And when we get done, the direct effect is there, but it's way less than half. So we need a theory, something like a theory of labor market congestion, to understand why unemployment spreads. Okay, so here's the first picture that pulls together all the job loss numbers that we're talking about. In 2009, around 2009, in that burst of, and then the other picture, which you haven't seen before, is the amount of excess unemployment. So that's measured here as the cumulative amount of unemployment above 3.5%. This is probably a good time to say that one of the ideas about the labor market that doesn't survive our thinking is the idea of a natural unemployment rate. We would replace it by what we'd regard as a more complicated kind of natural process of shocks and recovery from shocks, which has a predictable component. Some of the ideas that appear in Friedman's presidential address are still apt, but one thing that definitely does not survive at all is the notion that unemployment should be thought of as vibrating around a natural level. Rather, it vibrates around, and the vibrations are pretty small, around a systematic recovery path. So people who asked when we were 10 years into the last expansion, whether it wasn't the case that the unemployment rate in the 3.5% range must be unsustainable. It must be well below the natural rate, which most is usually taken to be between 5 and 6%. We got to 3.5%, the labor market should explode. But that's not the perspective that we take. Rather, we see that as a labor market that's put a long period of organizational effort into getting people into the right place in the labor market, and there are not that many balls left in the air from the matching process, and everything is fine until the next shock comes. One thing we never did find out is obviously unemployment can't go below zero, so there's got to be some point that restricts it, but we didn't find that. The linearity of the decline in the late expansion was pretty strong. Not that many hints that it couldn't go below 3.5, but we didn't find out. Pandemic stopped it. Okay, so we've done something which we don't believe has been done before, which is to exploit the dynamics of the Displaced Worker Survey. This survey is the only, or I should say, it's the longest large body of data that reads on unemployment type questions. It's people from the current population survey, which is a nice big survey, but it has very little longitudinal. It only has 1 year of longitude. And other surveys don't have enough unemployed people in them to get much of a handle on these issues. But because this survey is specifically on what they call displaced workers who lost, as I explained before, had more than 3 years of tenure. So this survey looks at these people and asks each of them whether they're currently unemployed. So you can take the unemployment rate then and then look at previous year's displacements, and you can find out the essentially estimated distributed lag of the people remaining unemployed, and get coefficients which essentially describe the time pattern of this longer term unemployment process that occurs for individuals after displacement. And that's neat, and gives very sensible and pretty precise answers to this question up to a 3-year span. So the CPS ends at just over a 1-year span. This takes us to up to a 3-year span. So it's not ideal. We'd like it if it went even further, but anyway, we can use these numbers to try to get at this direct channel issue. And if we do that, then we get, we can fit to the data from displacements, the amount of unemployment, that's the red bar, and then look at total unemployment. And you can see that there is some synchrony, but it's a pretty small fraction of the story. So although it would be attractive, and many people have floated the idea that that the reason for lingering unemployment was that people had suffered serious interruptions to their careers, and it took them time to get back on their feet. The story is completely right. It does take time, but the number of people involved, which I think is reasonably well measured in this survey, expanded to the universe level. It's just not enough people had that happen to them. So it's a good story, but it's not a large fraction of the total. So if we now use, this is a little breathtaking, but if you made the assumption that the time span of the unemployment elevation that showed up in that survey could be applied to the other sources of displacement type unemployment, layoffs, and so on, and then project that forward, you get, and you can't add these together because these are many people that can appear in more than one of these categories. In fact, essentially all of them get accounted as layoffs, so if you can just take layoffs by themselves. So they're important, but there's an awful lot of white area there, which is persistent unemployment, not explained by the subsequent histories of the initial victims. So we conclude from that, and here's just another way of looking at the same data. We conclude from this that, as I say, it's the direct channel is there, it's important, but there's other reasons why we have lingering unemployment. Now, there's also a direct attack. If you wanted to simply refute the hypothesis that the direct channel was the whole story, then there would be a serious embarrassment, because one of the categories of measured unemployment is new entrants. So a new entrant can't possibly be somebody who was previously displaced from a long-term job, but the unemployment rate of new entrants shows the same bulge and persistence in here measured over these years, but in general, there's an issue of excess unemployment of new entrants. So there's some communication of this alteration of the labor market that extends to others, such as new entrants who were not victims. And that's a specific version of what's generalized in the earlier findings. Okay. All right, so this step 3 takes us back somewhat to our earlier research. And our earlier research looked at how the labor market works in a normal period, where the unemployment rate was around 4% or 5%. And we studied the turnover process that's so evident when labor market's in that sort of intermediate stage. And we studied just how the job finding process operates over not just finding the first job, but circling around in the labor market. And just here's the same set of coefficients as I mentioned before, now interpreted as describing in part how this process works, and how long it takes people in this setting to find jobs. And again, these job finding rates that are implicit, that are estimated here, are vastly lower than the job finding rates that you'd find if you just tracked individuals in the CPS and asked, conditional on being unemployed, how long does it take to get the first job? That's typically just a few months. Even in the high unemployment groups, it's typically just a few months in the normal labor market. So there's a big gap in terms of the effective job finding rate and the which is very low, like a few percentage points, a few percentage points per month, as opposed to 20, 30, 40 points that you find for the first job. So I've explained that. One thing that's important to understand is that a lot of this involves short-term employment, interim jobs, experimental jobs, jobs that just didn't work out pretty quickly, jobs which people quit from, jobs which they were laid off from. There's just a lot of short jobs, and we can measure that in the CPS, and the numbers jump. So the short-term unemployment process seems to be part of the process of the rise in unemployment that occurs, not just for victims, but for everybody. So we in our earlier paper, we document this process of what we call circling among short-term jobs out of the labor force and unemployment, and then now that paper deliberately stayed away from all the cyclical issues. When we apply it to the cyclical issues, then we find quite substantial cyclical variations, increases. So this kind of behavior is part of the process that we're describing in the labor market. All right, so let's talk about models for a bit. So the first thing to say is that, of course, the starting point for modeling unemployment is the DMT setup. And so we're going to ask, first of all, what happens in the DMT setup, either as it's normally considered, which is with relatively fast job finding rate, or as we might modify it just by saying we've discovered that the effective job finding rate is much lower than the typical calibration of the DMT model. But neither of those takes you to the point where you'd like to be, where you can match those low slope linear paths. Then there's a pretty big emerging literature on congestion externalities in the labor market, which was not aimed at this particular topic, but our reading of it says that's kind of interesting and something we should think about, and we'll see that sort of works. And then you have to push the calibration pretty hard, but the idea seems to go somewhere. And then an idea that permeates the DMT literature, which is that the profitability of employment has a cyclical component. And we pull out one particular source that seems promising over the span that we're talking about here. Okay, so here's the basic DMT model. Most people emphasize the DMT model as something that's driven by productivity. But of course, we know that productivity fluctuations are not part of the process. There's no systematic movement of productivity, for example, during recoveries. So if we take the DMT model where there's no change in the profitability is taken to be a constant, then if you carry out the experiment that I mentioned at the very beginning, where uh, unemployment is a slow-moving state, or is a moving state variable. It's, how slow it is depends on the calibration. And started off at some high level to the right. Then in this phase diagram, the tightness labor market remains the same, the job finding rate remains the same, and you just move rapidly to the left until you reach the point of stochastic equilibrium, which is described by that curve. So this is just DMP, the simplest possible application of the DMP model. But notice, so I use the standard calibration here, and the dots there are months. So it only takes a few months to get to the stochastic equilibrium. So if this what we call the basic DMT model, well, this is just Cohen-Rogerson over again. Nothing new here. This just sets the stage for modifications of this. If you look at the time path, so here's the time path we're trying to match, the straight line, puzzlingly straight line, and not very sloped. And here's the path. So this is really a bad match to the data. All right. So, well, one thing we can do is bring in this finding that the effective job finding rate, you could have a considerable improvement in the match of the DMP model if you push the job finding rate way down, much lower than it is revealed in data on how long it takes people to find their next job. Well, then that gives some progress. That by itself does explain some of the persistence. Of course, it doesn't. It's a classic example of what I mentioned before, that our dynamic models are controlled by one eigenvalue, and so they curve down and they don't crash into that. They kiss the low level. The linearity, this doesn't touch the linearity at all, but it does show that that you can push the DMP model somewhat in the right direction just by changing a more realistic, effective job finding rate. If you introduce a congestion externality, on the other hand, you're dealing with something that's actually quite powerful. The externality here is modeled. There's a lot of different ways of modeling it, but here's a very simple way. The cost of supporting a vacancy is higher in a high unemployment market than in a low unemployment market. In that case, the phase diagram almost touches you can hardly see the difference here. So you get this movement, and it turns out this movement is very slow. You've got the same stochastic equilibrium up here, same unemployment rate, but because this gap is so much smaller, and that's what drives the process, it becomes much slower. And then you still have this largest eigenvalue problem. So you can't match the linearity, but you can get much closer to the persistence if you push hard enough. Of course, this represents a parameter value which if you push it a little bit harder, then the labor market collapses. The labor market is a vulnerable market here. So there's some question about the realism of this, but it's an illustration of the kinds of things that we probably need to think about. Then in terms
of just wanted to let you know you've got 10 minutes left.
10 minutes. Okay, my clock says 5 minutes, but okay.
Well, we had the technical difficulty, so I was going to give you some wiggle room, but if you finish earlier than that, just, yeah.
Well, I'm not going to, so I'll take the 5 minutes. Anyway, I have a clock right in front of me, so you don't have to worry about it. I know exactly what my time situation is. Okay, so, well, the profitability of investment remains as an eligible factor in the DMP model. Productivity, which has been the traditional one, is a non-starter because it's not correlated with the just doesn't do the right thing. But in earlier work, I discovered that, and this you can think of the labor market and the credit market as having factors that are in common. There's a pretty big literature that pursues that idea, that there's idiosyncratic matching, especially among smaller businesses, of lenders to customers, and it looks like from the data that it has the same kind of behavior as the labor market. So that's an idea worth pursuing, and there is a smaller literature that has taken on that kind of task. So there's this index of loan availability that the Federal Reserve Board maintains, which can be, you can infer, it gives a rate of change, you can infer the level from it by integrating. And then if you compare that to the unemployment rate, it's actually remarkably similar. I was just stunned when I put together this picture. So if you have a DMT model in which the unemployment rate is higher when credit is less available and more expensive, presumably, then that's kind of a promising driving force, as this picture shows. So the purple is the unemployment rate, and the integrated index of standards. This is not the published index; it's the one I've integrated from rate of change to level. Well, it's really it's a good variable if it can be if this idea can be done, pushed harder. Maybe it is the answer. And it has its own linearity, so it actually gives quite a bit of help on the question of linearity. So we'd offer this as our single most successful match, but as you can see, it's not a perfect match. It's still, there's some resistance during these earlier years when we don't get an explanation. But anyway, these are tentative ideas that I think are directions of future investigation. Okay, and then step 5 is to tackle this. Think of all the macro that we teach to students at every level. There's a great deal of emphasis in the business cycle on driving forces of the business cycle that may or may not be random, but if they are random, then there's also policy variables, monetary policy, fiscal policy on the transfer side and on the government purchases side. So maybe we're neglecting that. We have this unicausal model that just ignores all the macro. So let's give macro a chance. Of course, it won't surprise you that it flunks the chance completely. Okay, so we're going to look at real purchases of the government sector. This is integrated government. Government transfer payments, which are a potent counter-cyclical tool. Monetary stimulus, measured the modern way, which is comparing the policy rate to the equilibrium value of the short interest rate, Blaubach. Measure of so we know how to measure monetary stimulus now in a modern setup. We do it by comparing the policy rate to what the interest rate would be if there were no policies, so to speak. Okay, and then there's ideas that other people, including me, have pushed, which, for example, is that the persistence of unemployment is partly persistent movements in the discount rate, and inferred from the stock market. My 2017 AER paper pushed that idea with some results. So that would be a non-policy variable that one might well want to think about and ask where it belongs. It's obviously an endogenous variable, so this is just a question of what other factors ought to be included in the model. It's not exogenous. Total factor productivity, of course, was very big issue in the real business cycle literature, including the DMT model. Although let's see it here, of course, it flunks because it doesn't move in the right direction. Well, you tend, so let's start with real government purchases. This is the same format as I was showing before. Extreme heterogeneity over the same cyclical periods as we were looking at unemployment. So it couldn't be more different from unemployment. And government purchases fluctuate because the government sees different things to do with its resources, in particular it fights wars. So the Korean War over here is a big deal. And it withdraws from as these factors. So you don't get any sense that real government purchases are used to steer the economy. They're being used for other purposes. Transfer payments, on the other hand, we have extremely potent automatic and stabilizers plus policies, as we've seen in the last few weeks, the last few months. It's a very interesting fact that real disposable income in the U.S. rose by about 10% in 1 month, at an all-time high, thanks to especially the $1,000 injection. And the same thing, I could say I'm running out of time, so I'll skip over this, but all these factors look like they're kind of interesting and important, but they're very heterogeneous across the cycle. And yet the movement of unemployment is just rock solid, just under 1%. So we conclude that these other factors, they must be important. We should still continue to think about them, but it seems like the whole recovery process is dominated by what's happening in the labor market. There's a gradual expansion of labor supply as workers are reincorporated along a slow but steady path, and that accounts for the extra growth, and it's not a response to other kinds of policy. Okay, one more minute, and that is to look at what's happening recently. These are numbers that Marianna's been tracking the labor market in real time. So these numbers come from work that she's been doing. And there's been a lot of attention to the fact that the temporary layoffs have become a huge factor when in an economy where normally, so here's temporary layoffs, including back to 2009, and then have this huge spike, and then actually some reduction. On the other hand, the kind of unemployment that we're used to, that has a big increase and then a very slow runoff, is attributed to factors other than temporary layoff. The particularly important one was loss of a permanent job. And well, what's happened is it's hardly gone up at all. So it's tempting, although it would be vastly overreaching to say that. if you simply took unemployment to be this number, that there hasn't actually been much of an increase in unemployment, but there's been a big increase in temporary layoffs. A lot of people have said, well, wait a minute, all these temporary layoffs are, these people who say they're on temporary layoff are dreaming, and they're not going to get their jobs back. And they're going to turn into people who lost permanent jobs. So this is just an illusion. That could be, we're certainly not saying it's wrong, but if you look at the transition rate from the temporary layoff, which is the big factor now, into loss of permanent job over the 3-month period that we have it here. So this is data, recent data. Well, if you compare that to same numbers exactly, in 2009, way more, way faster transition rate than today. And the transition rates are very similar to what they were when the labor market was strong. So far, there has not been this transition. There's even some transitions in the opposite direction, which we've just started looking at. But there isn't a sign. Right now, it looks like if you just remove the temporary layoff people and said, in some sense, as far as the DMT model is concerned, they're more like employed people than you've got. Then you'd have a pretty normal looking labor market, actually. Okay, so that's it. Sorry to go slightly over.
No problem. Well, thanks a lot, Bob, for the very informative talk. I had turned off your video during the talk because I thought that might help with the audio. So if you want to turn it back on for the Q&A, feel free. So we have Bob, we also have Marianna here to take your questions. So just a reminder for people in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question, what you need to do is you need to raise your hand. So if you click on the participants button, then you'll see the opportunity to raise your hand, and then I can allow you to unmute your mic and to ask your question. So, Bob, maybe I'll start off while we kind of let the audience, think about their questions, think about wanting to raise their hands. I mean, you focused on the unemployment rate, kind of for this comparison across all the recoveries and the return. But I mean, there's other labor market factors that we can think about in terms of employment, labor force participation rate that I think maybe have not looked so uniformly the same across recoveries. And how would you want to think about that in the context of kind of the model that you're thinking of in terms of the data that maybe you kind of looks very consistent, but the dynamics of, N and E don't necessarily line up with those, and how we should think about that?
Okay, well, you're asking me to get involved in a controversy, but I guess I shouldn't shy from that. I've been involved in trying to understand the cyclical movements of participation, which I think was the main thing you had in mind, and of course there are very large persistent movements of participation, quite different by gender, that are big enough so that they actually matter in a cyclical context. The behavior of the participation rate and the recovery from 2009 was very much a factor in the decline, both the anticipated and unanticipated decline of participation. Then was a reduction in labor supply. At first, everyone jumped on the bandwagon and was saying, "Oh, we have a very slack labor market, so people aren't participating." Now that was not true historically. I've worked on that topic before 2009, but then participation continued to decline as the economy recovered, and the notion that it was just a simple response to slackness gradually disappeared from the discourse. So I would put participation in one of those driving force factors that involve translating in determining output, there's a big medium frequency component of output, which is not cyclical. Mark Gertler and Diego Kunin have a very important paper on that subject. So it's very important. The Romer's recent paper on why the business cycle has to be looked at in terms of unemployment and not other factors, not output. Please know output. There's so much movement in output. It's not cyclical, that it's not eligible as a and the same thing's true of participation and labor supply in general. We really need to understand that when we're talking about measuring the slack in the economy, we got to be serious about the fact that there's a lot of movements of variables that don't represent slack. We need to isolate. Unemployment is kind of uniquely, now there's different ways of measuring unemployment, of course, but unemployment is uniquely the way I think that one ought to consider how much slack there is in the economy.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from the audience. Kanya Paramaguru, please ask your question.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering if you had if you think about like a US recovery in like a cross comparative setting, like compared to, if you're comparing to Europe at least, the US does typically recover like quicker from recessions. As well as the information that's given in your presentation. I was wondering whether you thought about how kind of state protection of workers or unemployment benefits and just general kind of the level of welfare state plays a role in the speed in which recovery takes place. And also like, given that you're looking at like multiple recessions across time, like whether you've thought about controlling or considering how the welfare state protection differed during the time that you're looking at, and how that might have played a role in determining how quickly the US recovers. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, so first of all, in comparing the US to continental Europe, there's a well-known paper by Blanchard and Summers, which actually is in some ways a cousin of this paper, which shows that the U.S. unemployment rate had a statistically significant return to normal component, which is basically what we're saying, but Europe did not. And there's a suspicion that, although it would take a lot more analysis to support this, that the different labor market institutions of continental Europe would play a factor in explaining that. I think it's fair to say that in countries like Spain, where unemployment was revealed and remains essentially a random walk, are different from the U.S. Now, of course, right now there is a concern that unemployment benefits temporarily are at a level that is, for the lower third or so of the labor force, are higher than wages. And there's anecdotal, but nothing more than anecdotal cases of workers who say, I don't want to go back to work because it's going to cut my benefits by so much, won't be replaced by the cash earnings. But that's novel for the U.S. The U.S. generally is pretty tight with respect to unemployment benefits and other types of benefits, especially for high labor force participation components of the working age population. But you know, that is a rapidly changing area, and it's something that some people, not me, but some people have put a great deal of emphasis on more generous benefits as a negative factor for labor supply.
Well, thanks. I think everyone in the audience, feel free, if you have questions to ask. We have a question now from Claudia from the panel.
Just a second, let me turn the video on. Okay, so I have so many comments on what you just said, Bob, about policy. But let me do one brief comment just to give another data point to something you said about this crisis. And then I do have a question about your model because I think it's really interesting. First, you mentioned the fact that a lot of the layoffs so far have been temporary and kind of questioning, will those be permanent? There was recent research, Jose Barrero, Nick Bloom, and Stephen Davis have a paper that came out recently that said they think about 42% of the recent layoffs will become permanent. So I think it's something to watch, and I wouldn't play that down. Okay, so the question is, could you talk a little bit more about your concept of excess unemployment? The one thing that I was confused about is, I get it, there's a supply issue, but as you go on in a recovery, there's a lack of demand that could discourage workers from hiring people. And so I wasn't sure how, if that fit in your concept or if I was missing something with those two charts you showed early on. Thanks.
Okay. So on the first point, I'm familiar with the work of my colleague Nick Bloom and colleagues and co-authors. They too are just staring at the numbers that are coming out. The paper you're talking about uses estimates that are from from before the pandemic. So you saw that the proposition that you were mentioning is clearly true historically from our data, but we've just never tested before having so many workers say that the CPS question is along the lines of do you now have a job that you expect to be recalled to? And that question has been asked before, and not that many people say yes, but now just tens of millions say yes. It's totally uncharted territory. So our view would certainly be that we have to wait and see what happens. At the moment, I think we're looking at the right thing, which is the transition rate, which is the slide that's still showing. So we'll see, but we're not trying to make any headlines by saying it's some particular percentage. I think I don't think that there's a good basis yet in terms of data to try to answer that question.
Yeah, just to add, if I may.
Of course, please.
So the 42% that Claudia you cited, it comes from 1979, 1980 data by Katz and Mayer. The probability of temporary layoffs turning permanent was 28%, and probability of permanent layoffs turning temporary, I think 13 or so. And then Bloom and co-author used their estimate of 77% reporting temporary and the rest permanent. So yeah, historically, that would be the percentage. But as Bob said, when we are looking currently at the CPS data from April to May, how many temporary layoffs turning permanent, so far we don't yet see any, it's not much higher than normal times. However, as temporary layoffs continue, then the probability of them turning permanent may go up.
And then the second part of the question about excess unemployment, could you say something about that?
Okay, so your question was, what's the role of demand?
Well, if you could just talk through, like you had this big white area of like not explained by the initial job losses of various kinds. So I just wanted to make sure I understood what you thought was going on there. And I thought I heard, and I could be wrong, that like it really wasn't a demand story there. It was really something about a destruction of labor supply. But I don't, anyways, I'd just like to hear your story one more time about what that unexplained piece is, how I should think about that.
Okay, so if you, one can imagine an economy in which employment is basically controlled by labor supply. That would be most people would call that a flexible wage economy. In any case, whatever causes it to be true, it's a tenet of labor economics that's true in the longer run. So we're only talking about the run here. In a real business cycle structure where you have presumption of market clearing in the labor market, then the question is how you interpret that concept in a DMT setting, and the answer is, at least one of the possible answers, is that DMT tells you what the unemployment rate is, and then the labor market tells you that everybody who does have a job, everybody else has a job. That's the model. So that's one of the things that made us look at things that were indexes of demand, government purchases in particular. So, and I'm pretty sure that's true. I've done some work on using government purchases as an exogenous measure of output and employment, mostly output. We're far from having a complete model with 12 endogenous variables at this point. So you can stay tuned on that. But I think that there's sort of philosophically a notion that if you've come up with a finding that the number of people actually available for work, that is the labor force minus unemployment, is kind of a given. That's our finding. It's on a rising path during an expansion, and then the economy finds work. So that's a certain number of workers available, and the economy finds work for them. But obviously, that's not a very Keynesian view. So we're, stay tuned.
Great, thank you, appreciate that.
Okay, thanks. Next, we have Pete Clino from the floor. Pete, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, so Bob, I was curious about your dismissal of New Keynesian stories. I understand you have a positive story that doesn't need to rely on sticky wages or sticky prices, but I was wondering if part of it is a negative thought that the duration of the unemployment is too long to be explained by things like the duration of sticky prices and sticky wages. Thanks.
Okay, well, I like that idea. I hadn't thought of that. Or at least we haven't pushed that idea in particular. I mean, my view on the New Keynesian model is that everyone in macro now has adopted the New Keynesian model, so that must increase the rents that are earned by one of the few economists who has not, right? So, and I've always been totally uncomfortable with the basic Keynesian concept, which I don't think is even properly attributed to Keynes, but that sort of demand is what matters, demand determined output. The sellers create a call option for their customers, and the customers get to pick the quantity. Never made any sense to me. So, so my philosophy, and this is obviously a recrudescence of the business cycle philosophy, is let's see what you get from a model that takes observed data on the volatility of key measures like employment and unemployment and output, and takes that seriously, but looks for something other than a Keynesian setup. So that's sort of been my program for a while. So taking a completely modern concept of the real business cycle model. The original real business cycle model obviously was wrong in many respects, but the philosophy is kind of interesting. At least I find it interesting.
Okay, great. Next we have Tony Braun from the floor, if you'd like to ask your question. I see that you're unmuted, but I can't hear you if you're asking a question.
You must be using your...
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Okay, let me repeat. Bob, I'm curious about your forecasts for the end of year unemployment rate based on what you've told us today. As you know, what we're seeing is kind of a consensus forecast of around 9% unemployment. But you pointed out two different things in your analysis. First, the low transitions we're seeing from temporary to permanent job losses. And the second thing, the correlation between lending and the duration of the unemployment spells. And certainly one of the main impetuses of Federal Reserve policy and the Treasury too has been to extend credit. Are you predicting 9% higher, lower? What's your forecast?
Well, I've never participated in forecasting. The limited number of times I've done anything resembling forecasting, I've been so devastatingly wrong that I sort of learned my lesson not to do it. So I don't have I've been puzzled by the fact that I guess people like, especially at the Fed, who have a professional responsibility for having some forecast. I respect that. But I don't, I'm a, Jobs Day is a big deal in our household because we actually find out the data.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, well, we've got time for about one final question. If there's anyone from the audience that would like to raise their hand to ask something. If not, then we'll give you, we've got one last question from Alessandro Menuni.
Hello, thank you very much for the great talk. Maybe I didn't understand everything right. It's very interesting to see the unemployment rate that is almost linear and persistent, and that the Mortensen and Pissarides model cannot match that for the model as is. And then you suggest there could be a lending problems. Now, my question is, if that is the case, it would probably, if I understood correctly, work through fewer vacancies than the Mortensen and Pissarides model. So I wonder whether you could compare the vacancies that you produce in your simulation that matches the unemployment time series with the vacancies in the data. And if it's not perfect, maybe another explanation could simply be the matching efficiency of the matching function. Maybe at the beginning of the recovery, vacancies are there, but somehow entrepreneurs are more picky in their hiring process. So that is actually the matching function that is not as efficient. That is, given vacancies and unemployment, you have fewer matches. So yeah, that's the question.
Okay, so I guess the first thing I'd say is that through February, there really weren't any DMP mysteries in the labor market. The labor market was moved along its beverage curve. It was a tight market with high job finding rates and low job filling rates. Everything was just right on the DMP equations as we now understand them. Then as soon as this raft of temporary layoffs occurred, tens of millions, we were in totally uncharted territory as far as the DMP model goes. And obviously, there's going to be a lot of work now trying to, and people like Giuseppe Mascarini have been working on temporary layoffs even before they were such a big deal. I'm sure are gonna have a lot to say about it. But you know, it's kind of, I would say it's non-obvious, and this question of whether we're headed for something that looks more like the labor market of 2010, and when all the temporary layoff jobs, all the temporary layoff people have realized that they were wrong and they're not been recalled, and they're on, all the things that happened in 2010 happen again. That's one possibility. But we'll see. Again, since I'm reluctant to forecast, and I'd rather see some data come in. Stay tuned.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much to Bob and Marianna for the talk, and thanks to everyone in the audience for all of the great questions. We're already over time, even with our technical difficulties, so I will close the seminar here. Tune in this Thursday. We are going to have our next seminar, which is going to be Chris Edmond and Simon Monge, Unbundling Labor, again at noon Eastern time. Thanks a lot, everyone.